The scream that tore through the Wyoming pines that autumn morning in 1882 wasn't human, and that's what made Garrett Parrish drop her basket of kindling and reach for the knife at her belt. She stood frozen among the scattered branches, her breath creating small clouds in the crisp October air, listening as the sound died away into something worse than silence. The forest around Lusk had always been unforgiving, but lately it felt downright hostile, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the balance of things. She was 22 years old and had been gathering firewood in these woods since she was tall enough to carry a bundle. Her father had taught her which trees gave the best burning wood, how to spot deadfall that was dry enough to light easily, and most importantly, how to move through the forest without attracting attention from things that might do harm. But her father had been dead 3 years now, killed in a logging accident that left Garrett and her mother alone to run their small homestead on the outskirts of town. The sound came again, closer this time, and Garrett realized it was a horse in distress. She hesitated only a moment before moving toward it, her practical nature overriding her caution. A horse meant a rider, and a rider in trouble in these woods could mean any number of things, none of them good. But leaving someone to die wasn't in her nature, no matter how dangerous the situation might be. She pushed through a dense thicket of pine and emerged into a small clearing where a magnificent bay horse stood trembling, its reins tangled in fallen branches. The animal's eyes rolled white with fear, and foam flecked its neck. But what caught Garrett's attention wasn't the horse, it was the man lying face down about 10 feet away, his hat crushed beneath him, one arm bent at an unnatural angle. Garrett approached the horse first, speaking in low, soothing tones her father had taught her. The animal calmed enough for her to free its reins, and she tied it loosely to a nearby pine before turning her attention to the man. She knelt beside him, pressing her fingers to his neck and feeling the strong, steady pulse beneath his skin. Relief washed through her, followed quickly by the practical problem of what to do next. He was tall. She could see that even with him sprawled on the ground. Dark hair curled over his collar, and his clothes marked him as someone who worked for a living, sturdy denim and worn leather, a gun belt that had seen plenty of use. She tried to roll him over gently, but even unconscious he was dead weight, and she had to use all her strength to get him onto his back. His face surprised her. She'd been expecting someone older, hardened by years of outdoor work, but he couldn't have been more than 25 or 26. A dark beard covered his jaw, but his features were strong and even, with a straight nose that looked like it might have been broken once, and a mouth that seemed made for smiling, though it was slack now with unconsciousness. Blood matted his hair on one side where he'd struck his head, and his left arm lay at that wrong angle that made her stomach turn. "Well, hell," Garrett muttered, sitting back on her heels. She couldn't leave him here, but she couldn't carry him either. The horse might bear his weight, but not if he was unconscious and couldn't hold on. Her homestead was about 2 miles west, but Lusk itself was closer, maybe a mile and a half back the way she'd come. The problem was that the trail was rough, and moving him without knowing the extent of his injuries could make things worse. She made her decision quickly. She'd have to wake him up. Garrett gathered her canteen from where she'd left it with her kindling basket and returned to the man's side. She opened it and splashed a small amount of water on his face. He didn't react. She tried again with more water, and this time his eyelids flickered. She leaned closer, watching as his eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpening with pain and confusion. They were blue, she noticed. The clear, bright blue of a summer sky. "Easy," she said when he tried to sit up. "You've been thrown. Hit your head pretty good, and I think your arm is broken." He stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to make sense of her words. Then his gaze shifted past her to where his horse stood quietly munching on some grass, apparently over its earlier panic. "Storm," he said, his voice rough. "Is he hurt?" "The horse is fine," Garrett assured him. "Better than you are. Can you tell me your name?" "Russell," he said after a pause. "Russell Wright. I was headed to Lusk." He tried to sit up again, and this time she helped him, supporting his shoulders as he struggled against dizziness. When he was upright, she moved back slightly, giving him space. "You're about 1.5 miles out," she told him. "I can help you get there, but we need to do something about that arm first. It's going to hurt like the devil when you try to move." Russell looked down at his left arm and grimaced. "Damn, can you set it?" "I can try. My father taught me some field medicine before he passed. But I've only done it once before, and that was on myself when I fell from our barn roof. It's going to hurt worse than anything you've ever felt." "Can't hurt worse than it does now," Russell said, but his face had gone pale. "Do what you need to do." Garrett worked quickly, tearing strips from her petticoat to make bandages while Russell struggled out of his jacket with her help. She found 2 straight branches that would serve as splints and positioned herself beside him. "I need you to look away," she said. "Look at your horse and keep looking at him, no matter what." Russell turned his head toward Storm, and Garrett felt the bones in his arm finding the break. It was clean, at least, and hadn't broken through the skin. She counted to 3 in her head and then pulled, feeling the bones shift back into alignment. Russell made a sound between a gasp and a groan, but he didn't cry out, and when she glanced at his face, she saw his jaw was clenched so tight she thought his teeth might crack. She bound the splints quickly, working with practiced efficiency. When she was done, she sat back and wiped sweat from her forehead despite the cool air. "That's the best I can do out here. You need a doctor to look at it properly." "Thank you," Russell managed. His face was still pale, but some color was returning. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." "Probably bled out from that head wound," Garrett said practically. "Or frozen when night came. What were you doing out here alone anyway?" "These woods aren't safe for solitary riding." "I was taking a shortcut," Russell admitted. "Stupid, I know. I've been on the trail for 3 weeks coming up from Colorado, and I was eager to reach town. Storm spooked at something, a snake maybe, and threw me before I could react." Garrett stood and offered him her hand. "Can you stand?" Russell took her hand with his good one, and she braced herself as he pulled himself up. He swayed when he got to his feet, and she moved closer, slipping under his good arm to support him. He was taller than she'd realized and solid with muscle despite his lean build. She could feel the heat of him through their clothes, feverish from pain and injury. "My name is Garrett Parrish," she said as they moved slowly toward Storm. "I live west of here with my mother. We run a small homestead, just the 2 of us. Pleased to meet you, Miss Parrish, though I wish it were under better circumstances." Russell managed a weak smile that transformed his face, and Garrett felt something flutter in her chest that she immediately pushed away. This was not the time for such foolishness. Getting Russell onto Storm was a challenge that left them both breathing hard. The horse, to its credit, stood perfectly still while Garrett helped Russell mount, then handed him the reins. She gathered her forgotten basket of kindling, though it seemed far less important now than it had an hour ago, and led the way back toward the trail that would take them to Lusk. The journey took longer than it should have. Russell swayed in the saddle despite his best efforts to stay upright, and twice Garrett had to stop and help him regain his balance. They didn't talk much, saving their energy for the trek, but she found herself constantly glancing back to make sure he hadn't fallen again. Something about his quiet determination impressed her. He didn't complain, didn't make demands, just kept going despite obvious pain. The sun was well past its zenith when the buildings of Lusk came into view. It wasn't much of a town, just a collection of structures that had sprung up around the cattle trail that ran through this part of Wyoming territory. There was a general store, a saloon, a boarding house, a small church, and most importantly right now, a doctor's office above the general store where old Doc Hendricks kept his practice. People stopped to stare as Garrett led Storm down the main street. She knew what they saw. A young woman in her work clothes, covered in pine needles and dirt, leading a horse carrying a bloodied stranger. Let them talk, she thought. They'd talk anyway, they always did. She tied Storm outside the general store and helped Russell dismount. He leaned heavily on her as they climbed the exterior stairs to Doc Hendricks' office. The door was unlocked, and they found the doctor inside, reading a medical journal and smoking his pipe. Doc Hendricks looked up over his spectacles, taking in the situation with one practiced glance. "Well, Garrett, what have you dragged in this time?" Found him in the forest, thrown from his horse. "Head injury and a broken arm. I set the arm best I could, but he needs proper attention." Garrett helped Russell to the examination table, where he sat down with obvious relief. "Let's have a look then." Doc Hendricks set down his pipe and moved to examine Russell, his gnarled fingers surprisingly gentle as he checked the head wound and the splinted arm. "You did good work here, Garrett. Your father would be proud. The arm is set clean and the head wound, while nasty looking, isn't as bad as it could be. No fracture that I can feel. You'll have a mighty headache for a few days, young man, and that arm will take 6 weeks to heal proper. But you'll live." "That's good to hear," Russell said. "I'm grateful to Miss Parrish. She saved my life." "That she did." Doc Hendricks began cleaning the head wound and Russell winced but stayed still. "What brings you to Lusk, son?" "I'm looking for work. Heard there might be ranches hiring for the winter." "There might be at that. The Harris Ranch about 5 miles north is always looking for good hands. But you won't be doing any ranch work with that arm for a good while." "Where are you staying?" Russell hesitated, and Garrett saw the problem immediately. He probably didn't have much money, and the boarding house, while cheap, still cost more than someone who couldn't work could afford to spend for 6 weeks. "He can stay at our place," Garrett heard herself say, and immediately wondered if she'd lost her mind. "We have a spare room since my father passed. He can help my mother with things around the homestead that don't require 2 good arms, in exchange for room and board until he heals." Both men looked at her in surprise. Doc Hendricks recovered first. "That's generous of you, Garrett." "But won't your mother have something to say about bringing a strange man home?" "My mother will say it's the Christian thing to do," Garrett replied, more confidently than she felt. "And it is. Besides, we do need help with things. The roof needs patching before winter, and there's wood to split, fences to mend. Russell can do what he's able with one arm, and when he's healed, he can move on to the Harris Ranch if he likes." Russell was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Miss Parrish, I can't impose on you like that." "You're not imposing. I'm making you an offer. You need a place to stay where you won't spend all your money, and we need help. It's a fair trade." Garrett crossed her arms, suddenly defensive. "Unless you'd rather spend 6 weeks sitting in a boarding house room eating whatever slop they serve." "No," Russell said quickly. "No, I'm grateful. More grateful than I can say. If your mother agrees, I'd be honored to accept your offer." Doc Hendricks finished bandaging Russell's head and stepped back to wash his hands in the basin. "Well then, it's settled. Russell here needs rest for the remainder of today. Let his body recover from the shock. But tomorrow he should be fit enough to do light work. Keep that arm dry and clean. Change the bandages every few days and come back to see me in a week so I can check on your progress." Garrett nodded. "I need to go home and talk to my mother. Russell, Can you manage here for a bit while I do that? I'll be fine, Russell assured her. Take your time. She left him there in Doc Hendrick's capable hands and made her way back down to the street. Storm was still tied where she'd left him, and she gathered his reins, planning to walk the horse home along with her own mare, which she'd left at the edge of town that morning. But first, she needed to stop by the general store for a few supplies. Martha Chen ran the general store with her husband, and she looked up from her accounts when Garrett entered. "Heard you brought in an injured man," Martha said without preamble. She was a small woman with sharp eyes who seemed to know everything that happened in Lusk before it happened. "News travels fast," Garrett said dryly. "Always does. Is it true you're taking him home to your place? If my mother agrees, yes, we need help, and he needs a place to recover." "It makes sense." Garrett selected a few items from the shelves, coffee and flour and a small bag of sugar. Martha rang up the purchases, but her eyes were thoughtful. "Be careful, Garrett. You're a young woman alone with your mother out there." Taking in a strange man, even an injured one, could lead to talk. "People talk anyway," Garrett said, echoing her earlier thought. "Let them. My conscience is clear." She paid for her purchases and left before Martha could say anything else. Her mare, Rosie, was where she'd left her, contentedly grazing on the sparse grass at the edge of town. Garrett loaded her supplies into the saddlebags and mounted up, leading Storm behind her as she headed west toward home. The afternoon sun was slanting golden through the pines, and the air had that particular clarity that came with autumn in Wyoming. It was beautiful country, harsh and unforgiving but beautiful all the same. Her mother was in the garden when Garrett rode up, pulling the last of the carrots and potatoes before the first hard freeze came. Grace Parrish looked up at the sound of hooves and brushed dirt from her hands, her weathered face breaking into a smile. She was 53 years old and had come to Wyoming as a bride of 18. 3 decades of frontier life had marked her, but she was still strong, still capable, and still the person Garrett trusted most in the world. "You're back late," Grace said, taking in the extra horse with raised eyebrows. "And you've brought a friend." "It's a long story," Garrett said, dismounting. "I found an injured man in the forest. His name is Russell Wright, and he's at Doc Hendrick's office right now getting patched up. I told him he could stay here and help us with things around the place in exchange for room and board until his arm heals. If you agree, of course." Grace was quiet for a long moment, studying her daughter's face. Then she nodded slowly. "Tell me about him." Garrett did, giving her mother all the details of finding Russell, setting his arm, getting him to town. She tried to be objective, factual, but she caught herself describing the way he'd looked at his horse first, making sure Storm was all right before worrying about himself. The way he'd endured having his arm set without complaint, the quiet determination that had kept him in the saddle all the way to Lusk. "You like him," Grace observed when Garrett finished. "I don't know him well enough to like or dislike him," Garrett protested. "I just think it's the right thing to do. We do need help, Mama. The roof won't wait and neither will the wood for winter." "No, they won't," Grace agreed. "All right, if Doc Hendricks vouches for him, he can stay, but he sleeps in your father's old workshop, not in the house proper." "We'll be kind, but we'll also be careful." Relief flooded through Garrett. "Thank you. I'll go back to town tomorrow and bring him here." "Go tonight," Grace said, "before it gets dark. No sense making the man wait another night wondering if he has a place or not." So Garrett found herself riding back to Lusk as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The trip felt longer this time, maybe because she was alone with her thoughts. What was she doing, bringing a strange man home? Martha's warning echoed in her mind, but she pushed it away. Russell needed help and they needed help. It was that simple, except it didn't feel simple. Something about the way Russell had looked at her, gratitude, and something else she couldn't quite name, had stirred feelings she'd thought long buried. At 22, most women in Lusk were married with children, but Garrett had never found anyone who made her want to trade her independence for domesticity. The few men who'd courted her had expected her to become someone else, someone softer and more pliable. She'd sent them packing. But Russell hadn't looked at her like she needed to change. He'd looked at her like she was someone extraordinary. Stop it, she told herself firmly. He's injured and grateful, nothing more. Don't read things into it that aren't there. Doc Hendricks was locking up when she arrived, but Russell was still inside, sitting on the examination table and looking better than he had earlier. Someone, probably the doctor, had cleaned him up, and his hair was damp as if freshly washed. The bandage around his head was clean and white, and his arm rested in a proper sling. "Miss Parrish," Russell said, standing when she entered, "I didn't expect you back so soon." "My mother says you're welcome at our homestead," Garrett told him. "If you're up for the ride, we should go now before it gets full dark." "I'm up for it." Russell collected his hat, which someone had cleaned and reshaped, and his gun belt, which Doc Hendricks handed over with a meaningful look. "Remember what I told you, son," the doctor said. "Rest, clean bandages, and back here in a week." "Yes, sir. Thank you for everything." They made their way down to the street where Storm and Rosie waited. Russell managed to mount on his own this time, though Garrett could see it cost him. She swung up onto Rosie and led the way out of town, very aware of Russell riding beside her in the gathering dusk. "Tell me about your homestead," Russell said after they'd ridden in silence for a while. "How long have you been there?" 20 years. "My parents claimed the land when it opened up for homesteading. My father built everything himself, the house, the barn, the workshop. He had plans to expand, maybe run cattle or sheep, but he died before he could make it happen." Garrett's voice caught slightly on the word died, as it always did. 3 years hadn't made it easier. "I'm sorry," Russell said quietly. "It must be hard managing without him." "We manage. My mother is stronger than she looks, and I learned everything my father could teach me before he passed. But there are things we struggle with, things that require height or strength we don't have. That's why your offer to help is so welcome." "It's not much of an offer when I'm the one benefiting most," Russell pointed out. "A place to stay, food, and when I heal, a recommendation to the Harris Ranch." "You're giving me a lot more than I can give back in return." "You'll be surprised what needs doing," Garrett said. "And anyway, it's what neighbors do, help each other. Are we neighbors now?" There was something warm in Russell's voice that made Garrett glance at him in the dimness. She couldn't see his expression clearly, but she thought he might be smiling. "I suppose we are, for the next 6 weeks anyway." The homestead appeared as a dark shape against the darker forest, lamplight glowing yellow in the windows. Garrett felt a swell of affection for the place, as she always did when returning home. It wasn't much by some standards, just a 2-room cabin with a loft, a barn, a workshop, a chicken coop, and a few outbuildings. But it was theirs, paid for with her father's sweat and blood, maintained by her and her mother's determination. Grace came out onto the porch when she heard them approach, wiping her hands on her apron. Garrett made introductions, watching as her mother assessed Russell with the same careful attention she gave to everything. Whatever Grace saw must have satisfied her, because she smiled and welcomed him. "You'll stay in the workshop," Grace said, gesturing toward the small building where Garrett's father had done his carpentry work. "It has a stove and a cot. Not fancy, but it's warm and dry. Come morning, we'll sort out what needs doing and what you're capable of with that arm." "Thank you, Mrs. Parrish," Russell said sincerely. You don't know what this means to me. I know what it means to need help and receive kindness instead of judgment, Grace said. Now come inside and have some supper before you settle in. You've had a rough day and you look like you need a good meal. The cabin was warm and smelled of fresh bread and venison stew. Grace set places at the rough-hewn table while Garrett took care of the horses, settling them in the barn for the night. When she returned, Russell was already seated, looking slightly overwhelmed by Grace's hospitality. The meal was simple but filling, and Garrett found herself studying Russell when she thought he wasn't looking. He had good manners, thanking Grace for everything, complimenting her cooking with genuine appreciation. He answered questions about his background without being asked, explaining that he'd grown up in Kansas, worked on various ranches throughout the territories, and was looking to settle somewhere permanent. "Why Wyoming?" Grace asked. "I heard it was good cattle country and that ranchers here treated their hands fair. I've saved some money over the years. My hope is to work for a few years, learn the land, and maybe eventually buy a small spread of my own. Nothing grand, just enough to run a small herd and call it mine." It was a common enough dream among cowboys, but hearing Russell say it, Garrett believed he might actually achieve it. There was something solid about him, something that spoke of determination and follow-through. After supper, Garrett showed Russell to the workshop while Grace cleaned up. The space was exactly as her father had left it. Tools hung neatly on the walls, a workbench under the window, the cot in the corner with blankets folded at its foot. Russell looked around with obvious appreciation. "Your father was a craftsman," he observed, running his good hand over the smooth surface of the workbench. "He was. He loved working with wood, said it was honest work that left something beautiful behind." Garrett lit the lamp and showed Russell where the extra blankets were stored, where the wood for the stove was kept. "If you need anything during the night, the house is right there. Don't hesitate to knock." "I'll be fine," Russell assured her. "Miss Parrish, I want you to know, I understand that taking me in is a risk for you and your mother. I give you my word as a man of honor that I will never give you cause to regret this kindness." Garrett met his eyes, those clear blue eyes that seemed to see right through her carefully maintained walls. "I believe you," she said simply. "Good night, Russell." "Good night, Garrett." She left him there and walked back to the house through the cool night air, thinking about the way he'd said her name. Just her name, nothing more, but it had sounded different somehow. Significant. Inside, Grace was banking the fire for the night. She looked up when Garrett entered and smiled knowingly. "He seems like a good man, he does," Garrett agreed carefully, "and handsome." "Mama, I'm just observing," Grace said innocently. "It's been a long time since you showed interest in anyone." "I'm not showing interest. I'm showing basic human decency to someone who needed help." But even as Garrett said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. There was something about Russell that drew her, something beyond gratitude for her help or appreciation for his manners. She thought about it as she lay in her loft bed that night, listening to the wind in the pines outside her window. The last man she'd been interested in, truly interested in, had been Thomas Reed, and that had been 4 years ago. Thomas had wanted a wife who would stay home and tend house while he worked his father's farm. When Garrett had made it clear she had no intention of giving up her independence, Thomas had moved on to Sarah Miller, and they'd married within 6 months. Garrett hadn't regretted her decision, but sometimes she felt the loneliness of it. Watching couples in town, seeing her friends have babies, celebrating anniversaries. She'd chosen freedom over partnership, and most days that felt right. But some days, particularly long ones, she wondered if she'd chosen wrong. She fell asleep still wondering and dreamed of blue eyes and strong hands and a voice saying her name like it meant something. Morning came cold and clear, frost sparkling on the grass. Garrett rose early as always and dressed quickly in the chilly air. She could hear her mother moving around downstairs, starting the fire and putting coffee on. The familiar sounds were comforting, a reminder that some things stayed constant no matter what changes came. Russell was already up when Garrett went to check on him, standing outside the workshop and watching the sunrise paint the sky pink and gold. He'd managed to wash and shave somehow despite his injuries, and he looked better than he had the day before, more color in his face and less pain in his eyes. "Morning," Garrett called as she approached. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I expected. That cot is more comfortable than half the beds I've paid for over the years." Russell smiled at her, and Garrett felt that flutter in her chest again. She needed to get control of that reaction, and quickly. "Come on up to the house. Mama will have breakfast ready, and then we can talk about what needs doing around here." Over breakfast, cornmeal mush with bacon and fresh cream, Grace laid out a list of tasks that had been accumulating. The roof needed patching where some shingles had come loose. The chicken coop needed reinforcing before winter. Firewood needed splitting and stacking. The fence line needed walking and repairs made where posts had rotted. It was a daunting list, more than Garrett and her mother could handle alone before winter set in. Russell listened carefully, asking questions about priorities and available materials. Despite his injury, he seemed eager to get started, and Garrett appreciated his work ethic. After breakfast, she showed him around the property, pointing out the various projects and explaining what they'd already attempted and where they'd gotten stuck. The barn was in good shape, at least solid and well built like everything Garrett's father had constructed. The few animals they kept, 2 horses, a milk cow, and the chickens, were healthy and well cared for. The vegetable garden had been mostly harvested, with just a few late-season greens still growing. The real problems were the roof, the fences, and the wood. "I can work on the wood," Russell said, studying the pile of logs that needed splitting. "Splitting wood is mostly leverage and rhythm, not strength. I can manage one-handed, it'll just take longer." "Are you sure? I don't want you injuring yourself further." "I'm sure. Let me try at least. If it's too much, I'll admit it, and we'll figure something else out." They spent that first day establishing a routine. Russell worked on the woodpile, taking his time and resting when he needed to. Garrett climbed up on the roof with her tools and began replacing the damaged shingles, though she had to admit she was nervous about working at heights. Grace tended to her indoor tasks in the garden and started preparing food for winter storage, pickling and preserving what remained of the harvest. It was good having another person around, Garrett realized as the day wore on. The homestead had felt empty since her father died, like it was waiting for something. Russell's presence filled some of that emptiness. She could hear him working from where she perched on the roof, the rhythmic sound of the axe biting into wood, and it was oddly comforting. She was attempting to position a particularly stubborn shingle when her foot slipped. For one terrifying moment, Garrett felt herself sliding toward the edge of the roof, her hands scrabbling for purchase on the smooth wooden slats. Then strong hands caught her ankle, steadying her, and she looked down to see Russell standing on the ladder, holding her secure with his good arm. "Careful," he said, his voice tight with concern. "That's a bad fall if you go over." Garrett's heart was pounding, but she managed to regain her position and hammer in the shingle. "Thank you. I had it under control, though." "I'm sure you did," Russell said, but he stayed on the ladder until she'd finished that section and climbed down. His face was pale despite his tan, and she realized he'd been genuinely frightened for her. "I've been climbing on that roof since I was 12, Garrett said, trying to lighten the mood. "I know what I'm doing." Knowing what you're doing doesn't mean accidents can't happen, Russell pointed out. Your mother would never forgive me if I let you fall and break your neck my first full day here. My safety isn't your responsibility. Maybe not, but I'd still feel responsible if something happened. Russell looked at her intently. You saved my life yesterday, Garrett. That means something to me. It means I care what happens to you. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning Garrett wasn't ready to examine. She cleared her throat and changed the subject. How's the wood splitting going? Slow but steady. I'll have a good stack done by the end of the week if I keep at it. Russell didn't push the moment, just accepted her deflection and followed her back to his work area. The days developed a rhythm after that. Russell split wood and did other one-handed tasks, repairing tools, oiling hinges, fixing the chicken coop door that had been sticking. Garrett worked on the roof and the fences and started preparing the horses and barn for winter. Grace managed the household and kept them all fed with hearty, warming meals that seemed designed to put meat on Russell's lean frame. In the evenings, they sat together around the table, talking about everything and nothing. Russell told stories about his years working ranches, funny incidents with stubborn cattle and temperamental horses. Garrett shared memories of her father, finding it easier to talk about him with Russell than she'd expected. Grace contributed her own stories, tales of coming west as a young bride, of the early days of homesteading when everything was uncertain and difficult. Russell fit into their lives with surprising ease, as if he'd always been there. He was thoughtful and considerate, always asking before using something, always offering to help even when his injury limited what he could do. He made Grace laugh with his dry sense of humor, and he treated Garrett with a respect that was refreshing after years of men who thought they knew better than she did about everything. The attraction Garrett felt grew stronger as the days passed, despite her best efforts to ignore it. She found herself watching Russell when she thought he wasn't looking, admiring the economical grace of his movements, the concentration on his face when he worked. She noticed small things, the way his hair curled slightly at his temples, the precise way he sharpened tools, how gentle he was with the animals. She caught him watching her too sometimes. His eyes would follow her as she moved around the property, and there was something in his gaze that made her breath catch. But he never said anything, never made any move that could be considered inappropriate. He was, in every way, a perfect gentleman. A week after Russell's arrival, they rode together to Lusk so Doc Hendricks could check his progress. The town was busier than usual, cattle being driven through on their way to winter pasture, cowboys spending their last pay before the lean months. Garrett noticed more than one woman looking at Russell with interest, and felt an unwelcome spike of jealousy that she quickly suppressed. Doc Hendricks pronounced himself satisfied with Russell's healing. The head wound was closing well, and the arm, while still weeks from being fully functional, was setting properly. "You're doing everything right," the doctor told Russell. "Keep it up and you'll be good as new come December." On the way back to the homestead, Russell was quieter than usual. Garrett finally asked what he was thinking about. "December," Russell said. "When my arm is healed, I'll need to move on to the Harris Ranch like I planned. Start earning wages again, begin saving toward that spread of my own." He paused, then added carefully, "I'm not sure I want to leave." Garrett's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her voice level. "You're welcome to stay as long as you like. We're not kicking you out just because your arm heals. It's not just about having a place to stay, though that's part of it." Russell pulled Storm to a halt, and Garrett stopped Rosie beside him. They were alone on the trail, pine forest stretching away on both sides. "Garrett, I need to be honest with you. These past days at your homestead, working beside you and your mother, eating meals together, talking in the evenings. It's been the closest thing to a real home I've known since I left Kansas 10 years ago. We've enjoyed having you, Garrett said carefully. It's nice having help and having someone new to talk to. Is that all it is for you? Just convenience and companionship? Russell's blue eyes were intense on hers. Because for me, it's become something more. I think about you constantly. When I'm working, I find myself looking for you, wanting to know you're safe. At night, lying in that cot your father made, I imagine what it would be like to have a real claim on being there, on being part of your family instead of just a temporary guest. Garrett's mouth went dry. Russell, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything right now. I know I'm overstepping. I know I'm a drifter with nothing to offer but a broken arm and a few dollars saved, but I couldn't let more time pass without telling you how I feel. You're extraordinary, Garrett. Strong and capable and kind. Beautiful in a way that has nothing to do with pretty dresses and everything to do with who you are as a person. I'm falling in love with you, and I needed you to know that. The world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them, horses standing still on the empty trail, afternoon sun filtering through the pines. Garrett's heart was racing, her mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. She should be cautious. She barely knew this man. He could be lying, manipulating her. But when she looked into his eyes, all she saw was honesty and vulnerability and hope. I need time, she said finally, to think about this, to understand what I'm feeling. It's been a long time since I let myself care about anyone this way, and I'm scared. I understand scared, Russell said gently. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere, not for weeks yet anyway. And Garrett, thank you for not dismissing this outright, for giving me hope. They rode the rest of the way home in thoughtful silence. Garrett's mind was churning, examining her feelings from every angle. She was attracted to Russell, that much was undeniable. But was it love or just proximity and gratitude and loneliness? How could she tell the difference? Grace took one look at her face when they arrived home and shooed Russell off to continue his work while she pulled Garrett into the cabin. "What happened?" she demanded. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Russell told me he's falling in love with me," Garrett blurted out, then felt her face heat. "We were riding home and he just said it. Said I was extraordinary and beautiful and that he thinks about me constantly." Grace's face softened. "And how do you feel about that?" "Terrified," Garrett admitted. "And thrilled, and confused. Mama, I don't know what I want. Part of me wants to run toward him and part of me wants to run away." "That sounds like love to me," Grace said with a small smile. "Real love is terrifying, sweetheart. It means risking your heart, trusting someone else with the power to hurt you. Your father scared me half to death when we were courting. I knew if I married him, my whole life would change. I'd leave everything familiar behind and come west to a place I'd never seen. But I loved him, so I took the risk, and I've never regretted it, not even now that he's gone." "What if I choose wrong?" Garrett whispered. "What if I let myself love Russell and he leaves or changes or decides I'm not who he thought I was?" "Those are risks everyone takes when they love someone. But sweetheart, you're already taking a risk by closing yourself off. You're risking loneliness and regret and wondering what might have been if you'd been brave enough to try." Grace took Garrett's hands in hers. "I've watched you with Russell these past weeks. You light up when he's around. You laugh more, smile more. He makes you happy. Maybe that's worth the risk." Garrett spent the rest of the day thinking about her mother's words while she worked on the fence line. Russell was splitting wood within sight, and she found herself watching him, seeing him differently now that his feelings were out in the open. He'd said he was falling in love with her. Not that he wanted her or found her attractive, but that he loved her. The whole of her, her strength and capability and independence. That night at supper, Garrett was acutely aware of Russell across the table. Every time their eyes met, she felt that flutter in her chest intensify. He didn't push, didn't try to continue their earlier conversation, just treated her with the same gentle respect he always had. But the knowledge of his feelings hung between them, changing everything and nothing. After Grace retired for the night, Garrett found herself walking out to the workshop where Russell was preparing for bed. She knocked on the door frame and he turned, surprise and hope warring on his face. "Can we talk?" Garrett asked. "Of course." Russell gestured to the stool by the workbench, but Garrett shook her head. "Let's walk. I think better when I'm moving." They walked toward the tree line where the forest pressed close to the cleared land around the homestead. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to light their way. Garrett led Russell to a spot where a fallen log made a natural bench, and they sat down, close but not touching. "I've been thinking about what you said," Garrett began, "about your feelings for me, and I've been trying to understand my own feelings in return." "Take all the time you need," Russell said quietly. "The thing is, I don't think I need more time. I think I've known since the day I found you in the forest that you were different, special. I've been fighting it because I'm scared, but my mother reminded me today that closing myself off is just another kind of risk. A bigger one, maybe." Russell was very still beside her, barely breathing. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm falling in love with you too." The words came out in a rush, and Garrett felt simultaneously terrified and exhilarated. "I think about you all the time. I worry about you. When you almost fell off the ladder trying to catch me on the roof, my heart stopped. I look for excuses to be near you. And tonight, thinking about December when your arm heals and you leave for the Harris Ranch, I felt this pain in my chest like I was losing something precious." "Garrett." Russell reached out with his good hand and cupped her cheek, his touch gentle and warm. "You're not losing anything. I don't want the Harris Ranch. I want this right here. You and your mother and the homestead. A chance to build something real and lasting. But your dreams of having your own spread can wait, can change." "Garrett, I've been drifting for 10 years, always moving, never settling because nowhere felt like home. But this place with you, it feels right, like I was meant to end up here." Russell's thumb traced her cheekbone and Garrett leaned into the touch. "I know we've only known each other a few weeks. I know it's fast. But when you know, you know. And I know I want to spend my life with you if you'll have me." "Is this a proposal?" Garrett asked, her voice shaking slightly. Russell smiled, that warm, genuine smile that transformed his face. "Not yet. When I propose, I want to do it right. I want to be healed, standing on my own 2 feet with both arms working. I want to have something to offer you besides broken bones and good intentions." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away, and pressed his forehead to hers. "But this is a promise. A promise that when the time is right, I'm going to ask you to marry me, and I'm hoping like hell you'll say yes." Garrett closed the small distance between them and kissed him, tentative at first and then with growing confidence. Russell's hand slid into her hair, holding her close, and the kiss deepened into something that made her forget about being scared or careful. This was what she wanted, this connection, this feeling of rightness and belonging. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Garrett was smiling. "I'll say yes," she whispered. "When you ask, I'll say yes." Russell kissed her again, tender and sweet, and Garrett felt the last of her walls crumble. She was done fighting this, done protecting herself from the possibility of happiness. Whatever risks came with loving Russell Wright, she was ready to take them. The weeks that followed were the happiest Garrett could remember since her father's death. She and Russell worked side by side each day, their relationship shifting from employer and employee to partners in every sense. They were careful around Grace, maintaining propriety, but everyone knew that something had changed between them. Grace watched with quiet approval, occasionally making knowing comments that left Garrett blushing. Russell's arm healed steadily, and by mid-November he was able to do more substantial work. Together, they finished the roof, repaired all the fence lines, and split and stacked enough wood to see them through the harshest winter. Russell also began making improvements to the homestead, building a proper smokehouse for preserving meat and enlarging the chicken coop so they could keep more birds. "You're nesting," Grace told him one evening with amusement, watching him sketch plans for a root cellar. "Making a place for yourself here. If Garrett will have me, this will be my home," Russell said simply. "I want it to be the best it can be, for all of us." Winter arrived in earnest the first week of December, snow blanketing the homestead and turning the world white and silent. Russell's arm was pronounced fully healed by Doc Hendricks, and he celebrated by picking Garrett up and spinning her around, both of them laughing like children. "Careful," Grace called from the porch, where she was watching with a smile. "Don't break anything else just when you've gotten fixed." That evening, after supper, Russell asked Garrett to walk with him despite the cold. She bundled up in her heaviest coat and followed him out into the crystalline night. Stars blazed overhead, and their breath made clouds in the freezing air. Russell led her to the edge of the forest, where the trees stood dark and silent under their burden of snow. It was the same forest where Garrett had found him 3 months ago, gathering kindling on what had seemed like an ordinary morning. How much had changed since then, how much had shifted in her heart and her life. "I've been thinking about how to do this," Russell said, turning to face her. His face was serious, but his eyes were warm. "I wanted it to be perfect, but I realized that perfect doesn't matter. What matters is that it's true and from the heart." He took both her hands in his, and Garrett realized he'd planned this, waited until he had 2 good hands so he could hold her properly. The gesture touched her more than any grand romantic flourish could have. "Garrett Parrish, 3 months ago I was lost, literally and figuratively. I was drifting through life without purpose or direction, alone and lonely even if I didn't want to admit it. Then you found me in these woods, bleeding and broken, and you could have left me there. No one would have blamed you. But instead, you saved me, you set my arm, you brought me to your home and gave me a place to heal. And in the process of healing my body, you healed my heart too." Garrett's eyes were stinging with tears she refused to let fall. Russell's voice was steady but thick with emotion. "You're the strongest, most capable, most extraordinary woman I've ever known. You're brave and kind and beautiful inside and out. You make me want to be better, to build something lasting, to put down roots and grow old in one place. This place with you." Russell took a deep breath. "I love you, Garrett. I love your independence and your strength. I love the way you climb on roofs without fear and split wood like you were born with an axe in your hands. I love your laugh and your dedication to your mother, and the way you talk to the horses. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you that love every single day." He released one of her hands and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small object that glinted in the moonlight. It was a ring, simple and beautiful, a silver band with a small stone that caught the starlight. "It's not much," Russell said. "I bought it with the last of my savings in town yesterday. But Garrett Parrish, will you marry me? Will you let me stay here and build a life with you? Will you take a chance on a former drifter who found his home in your eyes?" Garrett couldn't hold back the tears anymore. They streamed down her face as she nodded, then found her voice. "Yes. Yes, Russell, I'll marry you. I love you. I want all of that, the life and the home and growing old together. I want it all with you." Russell slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her deeply, thoroughly, a kiss that promised a lifetime of such kisses. Garrett wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the love and hope and joy flooding through her. When they finally pulled apart, both grinning like fools despite the cold, Garrett looked at the forest around them. "You proposed by the trees," she said with wonder. "Just like I was gathering kindling when I found you." "It seemed fitting," Russell said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "To come back to where it all started, these trees witnessed the beginning of our story. I wanted them to witness this moment too." They stood there for a while longer, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the snow begin to fall again in soft, lazy flakes. Then Garrett took Russell's hand and led him back toward the homestead, toward the warm lights of home and the happy news they would share with Grace. Her mother cried when they told her, happy tears that she didn't try to hide. She hugged Russell fiercely and welcomed him officially into the family. "About time," she said when she'd composed herself. "I was beginning to think you'd never get around to asking, boy." "I had to wait until I could do it properly," Russell protested with a laugh. "And I wanted to be sure Garrett felt the same way." "I've known she felt the same way since the first week you were here," Grace said. "The only ones who didn't know were the two of you being stubborn and careful." They sat up late into the night making plans. They would marry in the spring, Grace declared, when the weather was fine and they could have a proper celebration. Russell would continue working the homestead, and they would pool their resources to make improvements. In time, perhaps they could expand as Garrett's father had dreamed, run some cattle or sheep, make the place prosperous enough to support a growing family. "You'll need to build on to the cabin," Grace said practically. "2 rooms aren't enough for a married couple and a mother-in-law. We'll add a bedroom on the back, give you two some privacy." "We can build it together in the spring," Russell said, squeezing Garrett's hand. "I'm getting pretty good at this homesteading business." Winter settled in cold and long, but inside the homestead there was warmth and happiness. Russell moved from the workshop into the cabin's main room, sleeping on a pallet by the fire until the weather broke and they could begin the addition. It wasn't ideal, but no one minded. The important thing was that they were together, a family in every way that mattered except the legal one. Russell wrote to his family in Kansas, something he hadn't done in years, telling them about Garrett and the upcoming wedding. To his surprise and delight, his sister wrote back almost immediately, thrilled to hear from him and promising to try to make the journey for the ceremony. Garrett had no family besides Grace, but the people of Lusk had become like family over the years, and they would all be invited to celebrate. As the days lengthened toward spring, Russell and Garrett worked on their addition to the cabin. It was hard work, but satisfying, building their future with their own hands. They laughed over mistakes and celebrated small victories, and every night they sat by the fire and talked about their dreams for the years ahead. "I want children," Garrett said one evening. "At least 3, maybe more. I grew up alone and it was lonely sometimes. I want our children to have siblings, to always have someone to turn to." "I want that too," Russell agreed. "A house full of noise and laughter. Children we can teach to work the land and care for animals. Sons and daughters who know the value of hard work and family." "What if we have more girls than boys?" Garrett asked, remembering something she'd heard in town about men wanting sons to carry on the family name. "Would that disappoint you?" "Disappoint me?" "Garrett, if we have daughters like you, strong and capable and fearless, I'll be the proudest father in Wyoming." Russell pulled her closer on the bench where they sat. "Though I'll probably go gray early from worrying about them climbing on roofs and setting broken bones in the forest." Garrett laughed and kissed him, marveling at how natural it felt now, being affectionate with him. 3 months ago she'd been alone, convinced she would always be alone. Now she couldn't imagine life without Russell beside her. Spring arrived in a rush of green growth and warm wind. The addition to the cabin was finished. A cozy bedroom with a large window that looked out over the meadow where wildflowers were beginning to bloom. Grace had sewn new curtains for it, and Russell had built a beautiful bed frame from pine he'd milled himself. It was a room made with love, and Garrett couldn't wait to share it with her husband. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in May, when the weather was reliably fine and the trails were dry enough for traveling. Russell's sister arrived 2 days before, a cheerful woman named Rebecca who was delighted to meet Garrett and approved wholeheartedly of the match. "I never thought I'd see Russ settle down," she confessed to Garrett while helping her prepare food for the celebration. "He was always so restless, always chasing something he couldn't name. But I can see he's found it with you. He's happy, really happy, for the first time since we were children." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and beautiful, the sky that impossible blue that only Wyoming seemed to achieve. Garrett dressed in her best dress, a simple but elegant creation in pale blue that Grace had helped her sew over the winter. Rebecca wove wildflowers into Garrett's hair, and when Garrett looked at herself in the small mirror, she barely recognized the glowing woman staring back. The ceremony was held outside, in the meadow near the homestead, where they'd all worked so hard to build a life. Neighbors came from miles around, and even Doc Hendricks made the journey, looking pleased with himself for having pronounced Russell fit to marry. The local minister, a kind man named Reverend Collins, performed the ceremony with simple dignity. Russell stood waiting for her in his best clothes, his dark hair neatly combed, his blue eyes bright with emotion. When Garrett walked toward him with Grace at her side, he looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. And when they exchanged their vows, promising to love and honor each other through all the challenges and joys that lay ahead, Garrett felt a peace settle over her that she'd never experienced before. This was right. This was where she was meant to be, with this man, building this life. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Collins said with a broad smile. "Russell, you may kiss your bride." Russell cupped Garrett's face in both hands and kissed her sweetly, tenderly, with all the love and promise of their future together. The gathered crowd cheered, and when they pulled apart, both were grinning and wiping away happy tears. The celebration that followed was joyous and loud, with food and music and dancing that lasted until well after sunset. Garrett danced with Russell, with Doc Hendricks, with neighbors she'd known her whole life. Everyone wanted to congratulate them, to wish them well, to tell stories and offer advice. It was everything a wedding should be, a community coming together to celebrate love and new beginnings. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart for home, Russell pulled Garrett aside away from the crowd. They stood at the edge of the meadow, right where it met the forest, and Russell wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on top of her head. "Happy," he murmured. "So happy," Garrett confirmed. "I never thought I could feel like this, so full of joy I might burst with it." "I know what you mean. This morning I woke up in the workshop and I just lay there for a while, thinking about how I almost died in these woods last fall. How if I'd gone a different direction? Or if you hadn't been gathering kindling that day, or if you'd decided I wasn't worth saving, none of this would have happened. It makes you think about fate, about how thin the line is between life and death, between loneliness and love." "I don't believe in fate," Garrett said, turning in his arms to face him. "I believe in choices. You chose to come to Wyoming. I chose to help you. We chose to open our hearts to each other. Those choices led us here to this moment, and I'm grateful for every single one." Russell kissed her, deep and slow, and Garrett felt heat rise through her body. They were married now. Tonight they would share that beautiful bedroom they'd built together, would begin their life as husband and wife in truth as well as name. The thought made her nervous and excited all at once. "Come on, Mrs. Wright," Russell said, taking her hand. "Let's say goodbye to our guests and start our future." The name sent a thrill through Garrett. Mrs. Wright. She was married. She had a partner, someone to face life's challenges with, someone to share its joys. It was everything she'd secretly wanted and everything she'd been too afraid to hope for. They saw off the last of the guests as darkness fell completely, helped Grace clean up the worst of the mess. And then finally, they were alone in their new room. Russell lit the lamp while Garrett closed the curtains, and then they stood facing each other, suddenly shy despite all their earlier certainty. "I've never done this before," Garrett admitted quietly. "I know that's probably obvious, but I wanted to say it. I don't know what I'm doing." "Neither do I," Russell confessed. "I mean, there have been women, but never someone I loved, never someone who mattered this much. We'll figure it out together like we figure out everything else." He crossed to her and began unpinning the flowers from her hair, his movements gentle and unhurried. Garrett closed her eyes and let herself simply feel, his hands in her hair, his breath on her face, the warmth radiating from his body. When the flowers were all removed, Russell tilted her chin up and kissed her, and the shyness faded away in the face of their love and desire for each other. They came together sweetly that night, with tenderness and patience and growing passion. Russell was gentle and attentive, making sure Garrett felt safe and cherished. And when it was over and they lay tangled together in their new bed, Garrett felt a completeness she'd never experienced before. This was partnership. This was love in its fullest form. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Russell whispered back. "Today, tomorrow, and for all the days of our lives." The years that followed were good ones, filled with hard work and deep satisfaction. Russell proved to be everything Garrett had hoped for in a partner, sharing the labor equally, respecting her opinions, supporting her decisions. Together they expanded the homestead, adding a small herd of cattle and some sheep, improving the buildings and the land. Grace lived with them in quiet contentment, helping where she could and watching with joy as her daughter's marriage flourished. 2 years after their wedding, Garrett gave birth to their first child, a sturdy boy they named Henry after Russell's father. Russell cried when he held his son for the first time, overwhelmed with love and gratitude. He was a devoted father from the start, patient and playful, teaching Henry as he grew how to care for animals and work the land. 3 years later came another son, Thomas, and then 2 years after that, their first daughter, Elizabeth. Each child was welcomed with the same joy and celebration as the first, each one adding to the warmth and laughter in the growing household. Grace lived to see all 3 grandchildren born, and passed peacefully in her sleep when Elizabeth was 2 years old. They buried her beside Garrett's father on a hill overlooking the homestead, and though the loss was painful, there was comfort in knowing she'd lived to see her daughter happy and her grandchildren healthy. Grace had died content, surrounded by love, which was all anyone could really hope for. The homestead continued to prosper. Russell bought the adjoining property when it came up for sale, doubling their holdings and allowing them to expand their herds. They hired help during busy seasons, always treating their employees fairly, remembering what it had been like when Russell was the one looking for work and a place to belong. Henry grew into a thoughtful boy who loved animals and showed a natural gift for training horses. Thomas was more adventurous, always climbing trees and exploring, giving his parents gray hairs with his fearlessness. Elizabeth was quiet and observant, watching everything with intelligent eyes and asking questions that showed unusual insight for her age. When Elizabeth was 5, Garrett found herself pregnant again, and 9 months later twin boys arrived, squalling and red-faced and perfect. Jacob and Samuel completed their family, and the cabin that had once housed just Garrett and her parents now rang with the noise and chaos of 5 children and 2 adults who wouldn't have had it any other way. The children grew up learning the value of hard work and family loyalty. They attended the small school in Lusk during the winter months and worked the homestead during spring and summer. Russell taught them everything he knew about ranching and animal husbandry. Garrett taught them self-sufficiency and determination. Together, they raised children who were confident and capable, ready to face whatever challenges life might bring. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Russell and Garrett took a rare evening to themselves, walking out to the forest edge where Russell had proposed all those years ago. The trees stood tall and unchanged, silent witnesses to their love story. "You remember how scared I was?" Garrett asked, leaning against Russell's side. "When you first told me you were falling in love with me, I remember. I was terrified you'd reject me, send me packing to the Harris Ranch." Russell wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "Best risk I ever took, telling you how I felt. Best risk I ever took was helping an injured cowboy in the forest," Garrett countered. "Could have been anyone, could have been someone dangerous or dishonest, but it was you." "Fate," Russell teased, knowing she'd protest. "Luck," Garrett corrected. "Or maybe divine intervention. Either way, I'm grateful." She turned to face him, reaching up to touch his face. He had lines around his eyes now from years of sun and smiling, and his beard had threads of gray. But to Garrett, he was as handsome as the day she'd first seen him, unconscious and bleeding in a forest clearing. "I love you," she said, as she'd said countless times over the years. "More now than even on our wedding day, if that's possible." "It's possible," Russell assured her. "I feel the same. Every year, every day with you, I love you more. Thank you for saving me, Garrett. Thank you for taking a chance on us." They kissed there beneath the trees, the same trees where Russell had gathered his thoughts and his courage 10 years before, where he'd asked Garrett to be his wife. The forest had witnessed the beginning of their story, and it bore witness now to their enduring love, a decade strong and growing stronger still. As they walked back to the homestead, they could see lamplight glowing warm in the windows, could hear the faint sounds of their children inside. Henry would be reading to the twins, probably, and Thomas would be trying to get Elizabeth interested in whatever creature he'd caught that day. It was home in every sense of the word, filled with love and life and purpose. Years continued to pass in the rhythm of seasons and cycles. The children grew and began to make their own marks on the world. Henry eventually married a schoolteacher from town and took over managing the cattle operation. Thomas, to no one's surprise, became a territorial marshal, using his fearlessness to uphold the law. Elizabeth surprised everyone by going east to college, the first in the family to pursue higher education, and returned to become a teacher herself. The twins, Jacob and Samuel, remained on the homestead, working beside their parents and eventually bringing their own wives home to what had become a substantial ranch. The original cabin was surrounded now by additional buildings, a proper ranch house, barns and outbuildings, worker housing. The small homestead Garrett had struggled to maintain alone had become a thriving enterprise, all because of hard work, determination, and the partnership she and Russell had built. They grew old together gracefully, weathering the inevitable challenges of life with the same teamwork that had defined their early years. There were hard times, droughts and harsh winters, illnesses and injuries. but they faced everything together, supporting each other, drawing strength from their love. On their 40th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, Russell and Garrett sat on the porch of their ranch house and looked out over the land they'd built together. Russell's hair was white now, and Garrett's was silver, and they moved more slowly than they once had. But their hands were still strong, and their love was still fierce. 40 years, Russell marveled. Seems like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. We've built something remarkable, Garrett said, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Not just the ranch, but the family, the legacy. Your father would be proud. My father, too. I think about that day I got thrown from storm pretty often, Russell admitted. How different my life would be if I'd just taken the main road to Lusk instead of that shortcut. I wouldn't have met you. Wouldn't have all of this. He gestured at the scene before them, encompassing not just the physical ranch but the people, the life they'd created. Everything that matters started in those woods, Garrett agreed. With me gathering kindling and you gathering your courage. Best day of my life, broken arm and all. Russell took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers in a gesture that had become second nature over 4 decades. I love you, Garrett Wright, today and always. I love you too, Russell, forever and beyond. They sat together as the sun set, painting the Wyoming sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple. Around them, their family laughed and talked and celebrated. The homestead hummed with life and love, exactly as it should. And Garrett thought about how close she'd come to never having any of this, how one decision to help a stranger had changed everything. She'd been gathering kindling that autumn morning 40 years ago, doing an ordinary task on what seemed like an ordinary day. She couldn't have known that the sound of a horse in distress would lead her to the love of her life. Couldn't have imagined that the injured cowboy she found in the forest would become her husband, her partner, her everything. But he had. Russell had gathered his thoughts and his courage and proposed by the trees, and she had said yes. And from that moment forward, they had built a life together that exceeded anything Garrett could have dreamed. As darkness fell and the celebration continued around them, Garrett leaned her head on Russell's shoulder and closed her eyes, content. This was happiness. This was what it meant to build something lasting. And it had all started in the forest, with kindling and courage and a choice to help someone in need. The Wyoming night settled over the ranch, peaceful and perfect. In the distance, coyotes sang to the moon. Closer by, children laughed and adults talked in warm tones. And on the porch, 2 people who had found each other against all odds sat together, hands clasped, hearts intertwined, grateful for every moment of their extraordinary journey. The story that had begun with she gathered kindling in the forest had grown into something more beautiful than either could have imagined. The cowboy had gathered his thoughts and proposed by the trees, and the woman had said yes. From that simple beginning had grown a love that lasted a lifetime, a family that spanned generations, and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. It was, they both agreed, the best ending they could have asked for and the happiest of all possible lives.